Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the seminar um, on illegal drugs in India and the 2016 Global Drug Policy Review. Uh, my name is Shamika Ravi. I'm a fellow of governance studies at the Brookings Institution and development economics at Brookings India. As you'd figure out, I have absolutely no background in this subject, but it is of incredible relevance to India and for countries around this part of the world. We have a team of researchers from the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., that have undertaken a project in the area, and we have the experts amongst us who will present their work and give us an overview of the motivation and what is it that their research has found. At the onset, let me set the rules. This is really meant to be an academic research seminar where presenters will present their work, and you must feel free to ask, no question is taboo. That's the idea of a research seminar. But we have to maintain the Chatham House rules, given the nature of the topic and the audience. So you will not be quoted or cited except for the researchers and your work. So let me start out by inviting Harold Trinconas to tell us what is the overall motivation for this research and present some of the broader findings from it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and I really appreciate the invitation from Brookings India to come talk about the findings of our project on improving global drug policy. This is a project that my colleague Vanda Feldback-Brown at Brookings and I organized last year in anticipation of the UN General Assembly special session on the world drug problem. And what motivated us to organize this project was the sense that we had looking at this from our different perspectives. I direct our Latin America initiative, and obviously in Latin America, the drug problem is a very serious part of the security issue. And from Vanda's perspective, working on Afghanistan, Somalia, South Asia, South America, I'm sure there's Africa, many other parts of the world. She also had a sense from her work on illicit economies that the discussion was changing on the global drug problem. And so what we tried to do in this study is bring together a number of case studies and thematic papers to consider what would be the nature of the discussions at UNGAS 2016. What would be the positions taken by countries? What was their national experience with drug policy, and how did this influence their international position? So we're trying to marry up research on national drug issues with geopolitical discussion of what position different countries will take, both at UNGAS 2016 and beyond. And the sense we have is that there's increasing divergence among countries on the issue of the international drug regime. And an increasing number of countries find that the regime's emphasis on drug suppression and the emphasis internationally on punitive approaches to drug use are problematic, and they're asking for reform. As we look across the cases, it is true that the regime has some significant side effects. But nevertheless, even though there are problems with it, there are also a large number of countries that still support the existing regime. And particularly critical players, such as Russia and China, remain committed to a strict interpretation of the regime and strong suppression measures. What's different about this UNGAS, essentially, I think, what is allowing this divergence of views to emerge is that the major players that had sort of created the regime and pushed it forward for so many years, beginning back in the 1950s, no longer agree. And the major difference, of course, is the United States and its change in policy. An incomplete change, admittedly. There's a lot of confusion in the United States and the US government over this issue, particularly due to changes at the state level. Changes that are still being the U.S. is still adapting to, but under the circumstances, the U.S. finds it increasingly difficult to play the role of the world's sort of toughest drug enforcer. And so the war on drugs is by and large receding into the past in sort of the U.S. perspective. And as many of you know who follow this issue very closely, even Ambassador Brownfield, who was sort of maybe perhaps one of the most committed war on drug warriors has said, how can the United States, when to paraphrase, when two of its own states have legalized recreational use of cannabis, how can the United States expect other countries to not experiment with new approaches? So one of the things that I want to do in this talk is just give you a sense of where the divergence is, what the debate is, where different regions of the world are going, why things have changed since the past UNGUS in 1990 and 1998. A little bit on the United States, because unfortunately our colleague, Professor Mark Kleinman, wasn't able to join us, and he really works on the United States. So I'll do a poor imitation of Mark Kleinman, and talk a little bit about the reformers and sort of what maybe some of the findings from the project are. So very quickly, I think that what's really changed since the past UNGUS is that it's really three things. First of all, the nature of the drug trade has become truly transnational, and so the traditional debate that tended to cast this issue into a north-south framework has begun to break down. Because increasingly the clean division between producing countries, transshipment countries, and consuming countries has fallen apart. Let me just give you a couple examples from the area of the world that I know best, which is Latin America. And Argentina and Brazil, which once had mainly been transshipment countries, are now increasingly seeing a lot of production, especially of synthetic drugs. There's transshipment from the Andes through these countries into Africa and Europe. And because of the way that illicit criminal organizations pay for the services that they require to transport these drugs through countries such as Brazil and Argentina, they pay in the substances that they traffic in, and therefore the local gangs create a secondary market that creates local consumption. Then in fact in Argentina and Brazil, per capita cocaine use is approaching that of the United States, which is quite high. So the other thing that has changed is the distribution of the costs and harms associated with drug use and drug trafficking. And the essential issue, I think, and the thing that's really one of the things driving the split between some of the new proponents of reform in Latin America, because of course there was always the Dutch and the Portuguese and the Swiss at the edges of the regime complaining about how things were organized, but really the Latin American countries that have been pushing for reform is really a reaction to violence. And this is a big difference with East Asia, for example. We were just in China last fall talking about this. This is a project we presented in 5 or 6 different parts of the world. Rates of intentional homicide in China are perhaps 1 per 100,000. In countries like Honduras or El Salvador, some of the most hard-hit countries in Central America, it's between 80 and 100 per 100,000. So really enormous differences in the level of violence. Even large countries like Brazil have 10 to 15 per 100,000. Colombia, 20 or 30 per 100,000, depending on the year. So part of this is in Latin America, the reformers are reacting to the level of violence and looking for alternatives. Whereas countries in Asia, they have a lot of trafficking, they have a lot of use, probably as much as you see in Latin America, but there's very little violence associated with this. So the debate in many Asian countries is more on the use side. How do we deal with the costs and harms of use? So this drives the part of the divisions. And so the result is a lack of consensus among states at UNGUS 2016. And so, the real issue going forward for us is between, what flexibility exists when the existing regime for experimenting with new approaches. One of the papers by Martin Jelsma from the Transnational Institute talks about this. And what are the effects of fragmentation of the regime? And there's another paper by Jonathan Calkin from Carnegie Mellon who looks at the effects of fragmentation. If you're interested, we can talk about in Q&A what some of their findings are. Let me talk briefly about what's going on in the United States. I think the key thing in the United States is there's trying to be some major changes in the use patterns. I mentioned, of course, cocaine, but one of the reasons why the consumption patterns of cocaine use in Brazil, Argentina, and the US are converging is it's reduced 40% in the United States over the past 10 years. There's been a major drop. Not very well explained. One of our authors considers this issue, but that's still, it's really a matter of debate. Instead, what we see is a growing use of misuse of prescription opioids, of course, which make up a very large percentage of the illicit drug use in the United States. And as those become unaffordable, of course, the heroin epidemic, which I'm sure most of you have been following in the United States, and in fact, some reactions from Congress now to deal with that. Another thing that's changed very much is the treatment area. This has always traditionally been something that there's been a sort of a complaint of reformers in the United States is insufficient access to treatment. But now with Obamacare, because of the mental health provisions available and other provisions, there is more access to high quality care for substance abuse. There's a number of state level issues, of course, driving this. We know that the states have been sort of legalizing medical marijuana and also recreational marijuana in a growing number of states. There's a referendum in California, is it this year or next year? But coming up very soon, this year, which will be a major change, I think, depending on what happens. It'll really set a trend. And of course, the Obama administration has reacted in two ways. One is, as those of you who follow the US debate, the Justice Department issued the Cole memo, which basically laid out the guidelines under which they would allow experimentation at the state level as long as certain red lines were not crossed. For example, no association with organized crime, no traffic, and no sales to children, no sales near schools. I mean, kind of obvious limits. And I think a recognition that without the support of state and local law enforcement, they simply can't enforce the bans. And also a tacit recognition the U.S. is increasingly out of compliance with international treaty obligations. I mean, once you have recreational use, legal recreational use, I mean, that no longer fits within the medical and scientific exception, right? So that's something the U.S. is starting to recognize. There's also some positive things happening at the state level, some experiments with shorter efforts such as swift, certain, and fair, which uses short penalties to modify user behavior. There's also problematic issues happening at the state level. I mentioned to some of you outside when we were talking that the fact that a good deal of the cannabis legislation being written in the United States is being written by the industry that produces cannabis leads to sort of, some have argued, to problematic outcomes, such as the increase in heavy use of cannabis. So as I mentioned, in Latin America, which is, I think, we would call the new reformers to join the sort of the traditional reformers, the Swiss, the Portuguese, and the Dutch, there's a good deal of efforts to change. I mean, there's a divergence of approaches to this, and I would say that really you have to contrast sort of the reformers, Uruguay and now Colombia, which are looking to legalize some softer drugs, focus on harder drugs. We can go into the details of this, but certainly an interesting thing is in Uruguay's case, it's really a preventive or preemptive reform approach, whereas in Colombia it's a reaction to 50 or 60 years of war, and it's part of the peace process that's going on now. So two different motivations there. Mexico, there's a milder, there's some initiatives for reform, but again driven by the impact of a horrendous casualty rate from the war on drugs, 150,000 people dead in the last decade associated with drug-related violence. And then countries like Brazil, a very large country, I think perhaps because of the role in the BRICS, it's something that where there's a lot of interaction with India. Brazil is quite hard line, it's much closer to the Russians and the Chinese on this issue, even though they also experience quite a lot of violence. So it's not all about violence. But it's also about the state's capacity to react to violence and manage the violence, and what states have learned. Let me just finish with four key points that I think we draw out of the 15 case studies that make up the papers that we have in this project, all available on our website. You're free to download them, drawing on 4 different continents. I think on the law enforcement side, I think one of the findings is that the high-value targeting approach is really something the United States has pushed based on its experiences in Latin America and Peru and Colombia, but also influenced, of course, now by Afghanistan and Iraq, going after drug kingpins, is really quite problematic. Because my colleague, Vanda Brown, has worked on this, and she can talk to it in Q&A, but basically going after the top leadership, she finds, tends to disorganize the criminal market and the criminal enterprise, leading to conflicts among criminal organizations and kind of leading to increases in violence rather than reductions in trafficking. Also some serious questions about the effectiveness of mass incarceration of users and nonviolent traffickers. In many countries that we've looked at, this tends to put people into the same system as violent criminals and leads to a new criminal class that is prisons essentially recruiting grounds for new members of organized crime organizations. Also, a debate on the role of alternative livelihoods in trying to replace the production of biological drugs in developing countries, and basic point that it's really quite difficult to do. We all know that, but the importance of having those programs in place first before you try to convince communities to abandon the production of illicit drugs. And finally, I mean, really the shift towards public health being a major emphasis of reformers, but also maybe something that a large number of countries can agree to. Obviously, the role of HIV, AIDS, and other communicable diseases, and the role of stigma and stigmatization of users in keeping people from coming forward to access the care they need, and what kinds of things can be done in the public health space that are effective. What are the debates? What have we tested? What do we know? What do we know that works? I think there's still a lot of room for experimentation there, and really that it would be valuable to have experimentation. And just, I would just say that the project basically doesn't have a lot of prescriptions. I mean, we're ecumenical. We realize that drug policy must be adapted to local circumstances, but we're trying to describe where the debate is going, and really with the hope that experimentation is allowed, continues to be allowed, and that ultimately the goal is that the threats and harms associated with drug use and drug trade should be contained in ways that strengthen the legitimacy of states and reduce the costs to individuals and to societies. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
This presentation was based on a 3-year study that my colleague, Colin Chen, who's not here, and I did in China, basically along the Chinese and the Burmese border of Myanmar, and as well as in Thailand and Hong Kong, the surrounding areas along the major heroin trafficking routes in China. The 3 areas I want to touch upon today is one is the serious problem China is facing now in terms of illicit drug abuse. And the second, the characteristics of drug trafficking in the Golden Triangle. That is the main source of substance abuse, drugs being produced and exported to the Chinese market. And also the slow and ambivalent move of the Chinese government towards harm reduction approach. Let me start with a little background about the Chinese substance abuse in China. Back when the Chinese Communist Party took over the country back in 1949, within approximately 3 years, through very draconian, very harsh punishments and penalties, and China essentially eradicated substance abuse, period. So just through massive executions and running up of drug addicts, locked them up in the prisons. And also it was at the time when the economy was barely functional and people were surviving on very minimum, and there's very little commerce going on, very little extra money to sustain any sizable drug consumption in China. So at that time, China was, in the early 1950s, eradicated drug problems. However, since the late 1980s, you know what happened to China's economy? China opened up again to the outside world, increases commerce with the outside world, and the economy improved with greater commerce, especially cross-border commerce with the outside world. Drugs started flooding the Chinese market. The drugs in China, the drugs that are being abused in China predominantly involved heroin and raw opium, very small quantity, free-based. You know, still a lot of people on the borders and smoke that for cultural and medicinal purposes, not so much for recreational purposes. Methamphetamine, this is the crystal ice, and ketamine, essentially as a horse tranquilizer, and it's been abused. And if you were to look at the official registry of drug addicts that have come in contact with the police agencies. By the way, in China, other than the official source, there are no other alternatives in terms of measuring drug consumptions in China. So officially, the central government collects data from all grassroots neighborhood-based police agencies and relying on them to record drug addicts that they've been arrested, that they come in contact with, and eventually funnel all the statistics up to Beijing, and they publish that once a year, usually right around June the 26th, which is the International Counter Narcotics Day. Around that time, they publish an annual report on narcotic control. This happened the year before. And as you can tell, here's a graphic presentation of the stats here. It's more specific to stats here, but this is a graphic presentation. As you can tell, the yellow bar, if you can see, is the total number of drug addicts that have been arrested or come in contact with the police agencies that have been recorded in the official system. And the green bars represent the proportions of heroin addicts or heroin abusers. The overall trend of the proportions of people who abuse heroin is declining. However, the total number of people who abuse drugs increased. As you can tell, the bar significantly increased in the last 10 years since the data was kept. And if you were to look at the drug seizures, the drugs being found and confiscated by the police, the total number, total tonnage, this is metric tons, have also increased. And here's the graphic presentation. The white lines represent methamphetamine, or crystal ice, and the yellow line represents heroin. So roughly, there's a decline slightly around 2005 and 2006, and from that point onwards, heroin and methamphetamine have been on a steady increase, and especially methamphetamine has increased significantly in the last few years, which signifies there's a greater demand for that product in the market. China's drug supply comes from a very single source, although China is also adjacent to Afghanistan. But over the decades, the majority of drugs, the illicit drugs that flooded the Chinese market, have come from one country, Myanmar. Since 2006, China started this national lab that analyzed the chemical composition or chemical signatures of all the drugs that the police agency seized from across the country. And the latest figure that I have here, 2013, 92.2 of the heroins and 95.2 of the methamphetamine seized by police in China were traced to one source, Myanmar. So in other words, over 90% of all illicit drugs came from one country. So this is very different from, of course, some other countries around the world where you have such a concentrated supply source in China. And the problem with that is also, I mean, one of the major reasons, in my mind, is that there has been traditional cross-border commerce between China and Myanmar. There's always historically, it's been a very close-knit border communities and commercial activities across two countries. And here's a visual presentation of where that Golden Triangle is about. Well, there's a so-called physical triangle place between Laos, Thailand, and Myanmar, and this is where it's located. It's on the Mekong River. The river flows through three countries. But there's politically, it's much bigger. It's about 150,000 square miles of areas where the government reach was very weak, and most of the activities there were controlled by the warlords and local tribes. The characteristics of drug trafficking in China presents some very unique characteristics that are very different from what we see from Latin America. There are no large-scale drug trafficking activities. Drug trafficking controlled by large cartels. There are none. There are no large trafficking cartels. And there are also no visible neighborhood-based drug distribution networks or gangs like you commonly see in U.S., in inner cities in U.S. And violent confrontation or rivalry among drug trafficking gangs or drug traffickers are very, very rare. The only time you will hear any armed confrontations were between traffickers and the police, because, as you know, in China has a very strict, penalty for drug trafficking. Death penalty is oftentimes the outcome. Traffickers oftentimes arm themselves in the event if they run into the police, they'll fight to the end in order to avoid the death penalty. So you will hear about armed confrontations with the police, but armed confrontations among drug trafficking gangs or drug distribution gangs is almost never heard of. So that's another characteristic. And the majority of drugs in China, based on our study, really involved thousands upon thousands of what they call mules or ants to move small quantities of drugs into the Chinese market. So very rarely you see a large shipment of drugs being seized. They do not do that anymore. I mean, they did that back in the 70s, probably 80s, early 80s and 90s, but now most drugs are moved by these what we call the ants or mules in small quantities across the border and from the border regions into the interior of China. And I want to show you some of the pictures on why it is so hard to stop drugs from coming into China. China and Myanmar essentially maintain very open borders. Porous is not even begin to describe. They are physical, they are official major cross points where you have bridges where trucks can drive over. Unless you have large commercial shipments you want to move into in and out of the country, you go through these official routes. But there are plenty other small routes, and this is where I was standing at the border markings. That little rock marks the border between China and Myanmar. And as you can tell, now I'm standing in Myanmar looking at my research assistant who took my picture, and he was standing in China side. And here again, I was sitting on the Myanmar side, the Burmese side, and that little river is the border. So as you can tell, the border between the two countries is extremely porous. You can move drugs back and forth easily. So it's really difficult to stop this unless you sealed off the two countries. It's almost impossible to stop drugs from being moved in small quantities across the country. And this is what we visualized after talking to lots of drug pushers and drug dealers and different levels of drug traffickers in China. Well, we have noticed that most of these people are entrepreneurs, essentially enterprising agents who maintain their own network. And they work through one another, pulling their moves successively from one stage to another. And it's really a massive bodies of entrepreneurs that are involved in this. And when we see this as a primary adaptation of this drug businesses in response to a social legal environment that is very intolerant of any organizations, period, that's not approved by the government. However, for decades, China has been very harsh in its strategies towards substance abuse and drug addicts. And they essentially, every time they run into a drug addict, they will seize them, arrest them, and throw them in drug detox center. Then if you do it again, you'll get thrown into labor camps, and you can be locked up in labor camps for 3 years. In China, the drug treatment is very simple. Essentially involves hard labor, manual labor, and that's the treatment strategy. However, in recent years, we've noticed that China is gradually warming up to the idea of harm reduction, and it's taking more of a public health approach. What I'm saying here is that China is not switching over completely, but it's warming up to the idea. There's some evidence there. One is that the number of people who are committed to the community-based, not committed to, well, they're essentially sent to community-based drug rehabilitation facilities have increased significantly. And there are also government-sanctioned methadone clinics to provide methadone as a substitution for heroin. And the numbers of the clinics has increased significantly in the last 10 years. And starting out in 2003, where you have 8 clinics around the country. Now you have close to 800 clinics across the country that provide methadone as a substitution for heroin abuse. And the people that are participating in these clinics have also increased significantly. So there are trends in China that can suggest that there is a policy shift towards more public health and harm reduction. But at the same time, China continues to punish severely on drug offenses. And drug offense is one of the very few offenses on the book that qualifies for the death penalty. And the government never published how many drug traffickers been executed each year. But Amnesty International compiled figures, and they claim that people that are executed for drug offenses are in the hundreds, if not in the thousands, each year. So China still reacts strongly to drug trafficking offenses. However, in terms of dealing with addicts, the orientation is now shifting slightly towards public health and harm reduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheldon. Now we move to Vanda Felber-Brown.
Shamika, you asked what are the major points of contention. Well, the very first one, really the fundamental one, what is in fact the purpose of the drug regime, and is the goal that has been repeated many times since its creation, namely zero drug use, zero drug production in certain periods feasible. So even at the last UNGAS 10 years ago, there was still a new commitment that in 10 years, by 2019, there will be no drugs in the world. ASEAN repeatedly issues that same statement, and in fact, they thought that by the end of 2015, there will be no drugs. They missed that objective. Clearly, ASEAN, countries in ASEAN are one of the major producers of the world of illicit drugs, as well as huge consumers. So many are saying that this clause, that the goal is to get to zero drugs, should be abandoned, that it is unrealistic and distorts policies toward suppression that is not only ineffective but harmful. But others, like countries in ASEAN, like Russia, still very much want the zero drug language. The second point of contention is about what are the appropriate policy in addition to what is the, and I should say that those who say zero drugs is futile, they say instead that the appropriate objectives are harm reduction, to minimize the harms that the drugs pose. Harms related to public health, but also harms related to insecurity, such as crime, to potential linkages to conflict and terrorism. So the objective is not zero use, not zero production, because those are not attainable, the reformers say, but focusing on how to mitigate the threats and harms that drug trade, drug use, and drug policies themselves cause. The second then point of contention, or the very broad point which has many elements under it, is what are the appropriate policies? So those who like the old repressive regime say that very strong penalization of users and traffickers are appropriate. Death penalty is fine. Countries in the Middle East, not just China, still execute hundreds of people per year for drug trafficking charges, which are often very flimsy. And you might have followed the huge controversy in Indonesia with President Jokowi allowing the execution of drug users. Most of the world opposes that, and in fact the International Narcotics Board, one of the most rigid bodies in the drug regime, has repeatedly, including just last week, come out against the death penalty. And not only has it come out against the death penalty, it has also said that the non-violent users should essentially not be penalized, which is another huge point of contention. The old believers in the regime love to throw users in prison, often for long periods. Those are countries like China, well, in China they nominally don't go to prison, they go to these forced treatment centers that are often labor camps, but certainly Russia. And one of the big motivations in the United States for moving away from those policies is that US prisons were hugely overcrowded because people were arrested for merely nonviolent drug use or low-level drug dealing, which many addicts will do to support their use. And so the US is one of the biggest jailers in the world, often with hugely distorted effects on African Americans and devastating social consequences. So the reformers say no imprisonment of users. It produces much bigger problem. It does not reduce use. People continue to use in prisons, and it only encourages the spread of HIV/AIDS and other communicable diseases, as users are afraid to come to get treatment and get help. Related to that, then, is the very language of harm reduction. Countries like China and Russia don't want that language in the treaty. Last time around, the United States helped kill the language of harm reduction, so there is no mentioning of that. One of the big battles today is whether the harm reduction, safe needle exchange, perhaps providing of shooting galleries for users, and public health approaches, no imprisonment, or at least minimal imprisonment, will be in the document. The zero draft has been circulating. The CND is meeting right now, and this is where the final battle over the language is being undertaken. The zero document, nonetheless, broke with the old, the zero draft broke with the old system by putting heavy emphasis on alternative livelihoods. The traditional approach has been that illegal crops have to be destroyed first through forced eradication, and only once that happens, then alternative livelihoods can and should be provided. That seems to be reversed quite explicitly in the current language, where there is a lot devoted to alternative livelihoods, a lot of changes in the proposed sequencing, and perhaps some unrealistic expectations of how alternative livelihoods can be effective. But away from forced eradication über alles, and toward big emphasis on alternative livelihoods, which all links then to the big emphasis on human rights. And again, that's contested by countries like in the Middle East or in East Asia, which are not comfortable with the human rights language. So with that background, then let me talk about Afghanistan very briefly, and perhaps we can continue the conversation in the Q&A. I would imagine that Afghanistan and the instability in the country, as well as the export of drugs, are of a lot of interest to India. So Afghanistan is facing, and has been facing for decades now, unprecedented drug crisis. Nowhere in history since the end of World War II, so since Mao eradicated the poppy in China, has a country had so much drug production, so much opium poppy production as Afghanistan. And not only has this been many times higher than anywhere else in the world since China. China in the 20s and 30s had far more still. But the percentage of the country's GDP that comes from drugs is unprecedented. It's between 30 and 50%. So one way to think of Afghanistan is it's a country, half of which is run by drugs and the other half of which is run by foreign aid. It's extraordinarily difficult to run and manage a country under these circumstances. The crucial importance of drugs, both from macroeconomic and microeconomic perspectives, then also means that inevitably all elites of all kinds, anyone who is a power influencer, power broker, warlord, is often linked to the drug economy. So yes, the Taliban taxes opium poppy. They have done so since the 1990s. Already in 1997, when al-Taliban ruled the country, Afghanistan became the biggest drug producer. It's a frequent myth that the Taliban suppressed poppy. They did not. They did so only for 1 year, and they could not maintain the ban. Now, that 1 year was the biggest suppression since Mao, but they could not maintain the ban. And before and after, they fully sponsored and support the opium poppy economy and tax it. And understands that it's crucial for them to get legitimacy with the population. However, it's not just the Taliban that's making tens to hundreds of millions of dollars from poppy. It is also power brokers that oppose the government or are key government officials. Many members of the Afghan government, from the national levels to the subnational levels, are deeply implicated. Key provincial governors throughout the country, and many other power brokers, many are businessmen. It is hard to have power in Afghanistan without having some relationship to the drug economy. Now, with that then, suppressing the drug economy is extraordinarily difficult. I mean, imagine that somehow there was some sort of miraculous wand that took away drugs from Afghanistan tomorrow. In the second poorest country in the world, imagine taking away 30 to 50% of the country's GDP. The country would be in utter complete meltdown. Conflict would be intensified. It's not only impossible, but it would be disastrous. The worst thing that could happen for Afghanistan is if drugs disappeared like this. This question also, would it be good for the international community? And would we see a big relocation of opium poppy production to Pakistan, where it used to be in the 80s, of course, before it moved to Afghanistan. But nonetheless, this dream scenario is not available. And so the international community has tried a variety of policies. Forced eradication that was hugely destabilizing and only strengthened the Taliban insurgency and many anti-government forces, various interdiction policies, as well as alternative livelihoods, all of which have amounted to very little, because in the context of continuing instability that today is bigger than it has been any time since 2007. The level of conflict intensity is greatest since 2007, and Afghanistan is in on a precipice, frankly. So in this context of insecurity, counter-narcotics policy cannot work. And so the Obama administration has decided to break with the mantra, the doctrine of counter-narcotics policies, which was that in order to defeat insurgencies, one has to take the money away, one has to defund them by smashing the illicit economy. This mantra was propagated from Colombia. It did not work in Colombia. It was counterproductive there. And it did not work in Afghanistan, and in fact was making things much worse. So when the Obama administration came to power in 2009, they said, we will not fund forced eradication. In terms of cultivation level, that made essentially no difference, because even when there was forced eradication, there was still so much production that Afghanistan vastly oversupplied the global market. But the fact that the government was not now officially seen as the enemy of the people helped reduce the legitimacy of the Taliban, at least to some extent. But alternative livelihoods efforts were very ineffective, because a lot of money went to the most violently contested areas, places like Helmand and Kandahar, where the hundreds of millions, almost $1 billion that the US put into alternative livelihoods was just wasted. So where are we today in Afghanistan? Well, again, the reality is there is no quick fix. Under the most auspicious circumstances, if conflict ended in 2017, and if only wise policies were adopted and the immense corruption of the Afghanistan government disappeared, if all of a sudden Afghanistan became Thailand of the 1980s, it would take decades of rural development and economic growth for drugs to substantially diminish. Now, I'm under no illusion that in 2017, Afghanistan will look like Thailand in 1981. We should not focus on eradication. Russia has been trying to force it onto Afghanistan, and Afghanistan would be wise to stay away from that policy, because it will just make its life politically impossible, and it will not drive production down. Economic development and alternative livelihoods should focus on areas that are stable. That is difficult, because what it means is that the populations that have the most difficult life in the most contested area will not qualify for foreign aid. But that might be a bitter pill to swallow, but the reality is that when a lot of money is injected into highly contested area, it does not do good. It does not reverse the economic dynamics, and in fact, it stimulates conflict. There are still pockets of Afghanistan where the situation is not as violent as in Helmand, Kandahar, Zabul, places like Herat, for example, to some extent Balkh, where some level of rural development is possible. But the most important thing that can happen for Afghanistan is that from the perspective of ultimate drug suppression and more effective counter-narcotics policies, is that conflict subsides. Again, we are in nowhere close to having that materialized. Some of you might follow the negotiations in Pakistan, where the Afghan government is desperately hoping to lure the Taliban to the negotiating table, and the Taliban, feeling very confident, is saying, no, we're not interested in coming to the table. And perhaps in the Q&A we can talk about Colombia and the differences in the peace process in Colombia and the implications for drug policies as well. And finally, the one policy that the international community should have adopted and failed systematically is to focus on drug treatment in Afghanistan. Opium poppy is used as a medicine, and indeed, one of the big points of contention at the Angas is also access to medicine, where much of the developing world has close to no access to treating pain. Pain is vastly undertreated, and China tried very hard to get ketamine scheduled higher to shrink supply, and failed in the policy because African countries were mobilized. For African countries, ketamine is not a very effective, but often the only painkiller and anesthetic available during surgeries. So China failed in that effort. But anyways, the problem of lack of access to medication in Afghanistan is acute, despite the fact that there is so much opium poppy produced. But of course, then family react to just simply giving out to children and family members any opium resin that they scrape from the capsules. And one of the effects is then big spread of addiction, and increasingly big spread of not just traditional opium use, but also heroin and all the problems that come with intravenous heroin use without clean needles, all the spread of HIV, AIDS, hepatitis, etc. Afghanistan has about 24 clinics for treating addicts, and if you have been to any of them, you never want to come back. They are often just terrible places. Most addicts are simply chained to beds to go through detox, and that's the extent of any available care. And that indeed is a condition, that indeed is a policy intervention space where much more could happen, at least in big places that are still reasonably safe, such as Kabul, and I say reasonably, Herat city, and several others. And with respect to how to deal with narco-terrorism, the most effective strategy is one of much more thoughtful and selective interdiction. So rather than treating interdiction as a blanket policy, we simply interdict any random flow of drugs, which produces many side effects and does not drive flows down. Interdiction should be geared toward those that have the greatest connection to terrorist groups. And this is indeed what NATO has been trying to do in Afghanistan since 2009, but with the decrease of NATO presence, a lot of that policy is evaporating simply because there are no more forces available to focus on that nexus, on that interdiction. Thank you.